Hello, this is Dr. Muriel Rand, and this is task 3 for the assessment task on edTPA, the Early Childhood Education Handbook. And this video is part 3, and we're going to go over the assessment commentary. It's probably helpful while you're watching this video to open the assessment commentary so that you can see the questions as I go over each one of them. So just stop the video and look at each question as I'm working on it. So the first question is analyzing children's learning. You're going to identify the specific language and literacy learning objectives for the common assessment. So that should come from the lesson plan. So think about if your common assessment is from your second lesson, then go to the language and literacy objectives for your second lesson. So that's part A. Part B, you're going to provide a graphic, either a table or a chart that summarizes the class learning for the common assessment. I went over that already in video 1. So if you don't remember that, go back to video 1. Then you're going to use, in part C, you're going to use the summary you provided, the table or the chart, in prompt B to analyze the patterns of literacy and language learning for the whole class. So what were the strengths? What did they do well in general? And what were some of the weaknesses? What were some of the areas that your class as a whole struggled with? And then for question 1D, you're going to analyze the patterns of learning for your 2 focus children. And you can reference the 3 sources of evidence you collected for each of the 2 focus children. That would be your video evidence of learning, your work samples, and your observational notes, your anecdotal notes. For commentary question 2, you are going to identify the format in which you submitted your evidence of feedback for the 2 focus children. So literally for question 2A, all you do is just tell them what feedback you are submitting so that they know what to look for. And then in question 2B, you're going to explain how the feedback you provided to the 2 focused children addresses their individual and developmental strengths and needs relative to language and literacy development. So again, what did they do well? And focus specifically on the objectives of your lesson, the literacy objectives of your lesson. What did they do well? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their needs? For commentary question part C, you're going to describe how you will support each focus child to understand and use this feedback to further their learning related to the learning objectives, either within the learning segment or at a later time. So let me go over this really carefully because this is one of the areas that our candidates have not scored as high on. You're going to be specific and describe the next lesson you would implement to help your candidates use the feedback you gave. Specific feedback includes such things as questioning, pointing to successful use of vocabulary or a strategy, naming a type of question that they answered correctly, pointing to and naming errors, suggesting information that would help them answer the question successfully. That's what they're looking for. Check marks or points deducted, grades or scores, that does not meet level 3 of the rubric. Even when you distinguish errors from correct responses. So in other words, just giving them a score is not considered feedback. You have to tell them exactly what they did well or what they need to work on better. And it's not enough to just say good job, obviously. You want descriptive feedback. Here's an example for how you would get your students to understand the feedback. The candidate goes over new words the focused children have had difficulty reading and how they can be decoded. That meets their needs, or the candidate reminds the children of the specific decoding skills that they used when they successfully read a new word, strengths. So in other words, you can give them feedback on what they need to do or on what they did well that they should continue to do. So those are examples for understanding feedback. And then you also have to give examples for how you will get them to use your feedback. So here's an example. The candidate asks the focused children to read a new passage that contains words that they missed earlier, or the candidate asks children to read new words using similar decoding skills to the ones they did well. So once again, getting them to use the feedback can focus on what they need to still learn or on their strengths, on what they did well. When you're answering this question, make sure that you give examples for both. How will you get your students to understand the feedback you gave them? And how will you get your students to use the feedback you gave them? This is a tricky question, so just be really careful that you're answering both parts. Then question 3B is explain how the children were able to use the key vocabulary to support their learning of the content. And you're going to use concrete examples from either the video clips or the children's work samples as evidence. And the evidence from the video clips may focus on one or more children. It doesn't have to be your focus students, in other words. And then the use of vocabulary can include children correctly verbalizing or writing the words, sounds, phrases, or correctly answering questions when the candidate says or writes the vocabulary. Attempted use includes verbal or written attempts, as well as attempts to understand the candidate saying or writing the words. So in other words, you can show how the students use them in a variety of different ways. They might actually say the words out loud, they might write the words, or they might respond to you when you're asking them about the words. It's not, for question 3, it's not sufficient for you to point to the artifact and just make a general statement. For example, as seen in the work samples, the children used the vocabulary. Instead, you must explain how they used it and or whether they were unable to use it. So child 1 and 2 used the vocabulary and also explicitly connected it with the text we read. Child 1 was unable to use the word blah, blah, blah correctly. So again, be very clear and explain this in depth from your work samples. In other words, give evidence, prove your point. Question 4A, based on your analysis of children's learning, describe the next steps for instruction to impact children's learning. And this, when you describe what you're going to do next, you need to describe what you'll do for the whole class, like what the next steps would be for the whole class. And this can be an actual lesson plan. I mean, you don't have to write it in lesson plan format, but be specific. You want to really give a lot of detail here. What are the next steps for the focus students? And what are the next steps for other students with special learning needs? Try to include all 3 of those groups. You can put 3 different paragraphs in here for that. And again, it should be very specific. What would you teach next? Don't just say, oh, I will read another informational text. Specify what the informational text is. Specify how you would read it to them. Specify what they would be doing. Specify what the independent practice would be. You see my point? Like, write this as if it were the next lesson plan. And again, include all 3 of those different students, the whole class, the focus students, and any other students with special learning needs. In question 4B, you're going to explain how these next steps follow from your analysis of children's learning. And in other words, you're going to say, because my students were weak in identifying, let's say, in retelling and identifying the characters, I'm going to focus more on character identification. And the most important part of question 4B is you're going to support your explanation with principles from research and or developmental theory. Please use high quality sources from your previous courses. Do not use websites. I've seen people put in like education.com and other websites. They're looking for you to use the stuff that you've learned in your courses. So, open up your textbooks, find a theorist that you can cite, look at some research that you had to read in some of your classes, go back to the previous work that you've done and pull in some sources. If you just want a score of 3, which is all you need to pass, probably citing 1 is fine. If you're interested in getting a score of 4, and I hope many of you are, I would put multiple sources in here, maybe 2 or 3. At the end of your commentary, this is important, you're going to insert a copy of the common assessment or the directions for your common assessment, and if applicable, include directions or prompts provided to the children. So for example, if you were doing a graphic organizer, the directions might be actually on the graphic organizer, and then you can just include that. But if you were having the students retell a story, for example, you need to include the directions that you gave the children in order to do that assessment. That goes at the end of the commentary, and it does not count in your page count for the commentary. So just put that at the very end. So in order to finish task 3, You're going to reread all the requirements in the handbook for task 3. Do not rely on me. Do not rely on these videos. This is really important. This is for licensing you. So you need to really take responsibility and go back over the handbook and read every bit of task 3 again. Again, task 3 I find is very confusing. I don't think it's particularly hard. It's just there's so many little pieces to it. And if you don't include all of the files, you could get an incomplete, and then you're going to have to redo task 3. So just make sure you have all the files. Review the evidence chart that starts on page 43. This is going to be very important for submitting all of edTPA. This tells you what font size to use, what file types, how long, the page limits for everything. So before you actually submit your files, you're going to want to have that evidence chart open and review all of your files. And then finally, I posted a self-evaluation criteria document on task 3, similar to the one that I did for task 1 and task 2. And this is just a checklist that has the rubric criteria of how you're going to be scored on task 3. So make sure you take a look at that and be very critical and say to yourself, have I included all of that in my commentary? And that's it. And I think you're going to do fantastic. And I'm here to support you. So the next thing that we'll be talking about is how to actually submit edTPA.